The first thing Elena Voss noticed was the cold. It was bone deep, coiling through her veins like a frozen serpent, and it felt like she might never be warm again. The next thing was the noise, a low hum of machinery thrumming through the walls of the Orion 7. A sound so familiar it should have been comforting, but instead made her heart pound harder. The cryosleep chamber hissed as the glass canopy retracted, releasing a fog of supercooled vapor into the air. Captain Voss tried to sit up, but immediately regretted it. Her muscles screamed in protest, and the nausea hit her like a sledgehammer. She gasped, drawing in a shallow breath that tasted strange, metallic, as if laced with something off. Forcing herself upright, she gripped the edge of the pod to steady her shaking hands. Around her, the rest of the cryosleep chambers hissed to life, steam rolling across the metallic floor. Cryopods disengaged. Crew revival initiated. Status critical, announced a sterile voice through the intercom, more mechanized than usual, distorted at the edges. Elena blinked the fog from her eyes and scanned the chamber. 4 pods, 4 groggy crew members struggling to life. Reyes coughed first, bent over double and hacking like his lungs were made of gravel. Lieutenant Mark "Shark" Hewitt lurched upright with a growl of irritation, already yanking at his oxygen mask. Rhea Park sat upright and froze, her pale face unreadable as she blinked into the cold. And Alex Sarin, always the optimist, leaned back against his pod with a shivering smile. "Welcome back, Captain," Alex croaked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Is it too soon to ask what the hell just happened?" Elena grimaced, her voice hoarse. "We're not supposed to be awake yet." She glanced at the countdown timer on her pod. Still over 6 months from arrival. The Orion 7 had revived them far too early. "Great," Hewitt muttered, stumbling out of his pod and bracing himself against the wall. "So, what's the malfunction this time? One of the nav systems decided to throw a tantrum?" Reyes rubbed his temples, his skin slick with sweat. "Number, if it were systems failure, we'd still be asleep. Something triggered a critical override. It's protocol." "Protocol?" Rhea's voice was quiet but sharp. She had risen now, her fingers brushing over a frost-covered locker. "For what?" A sound cut through the room, a sharp, distant thump that reverberated through the walls. Everyone froze. Elena's eyes darted toward the cryosleep chamber door, then back to the crew. "Get dressed. Gear up. We need answers. Now," she ordered. Her authority snapped them into action despite their sluggish movements. They climbed into thermoregulation suits, buckling up tools and oxygen monitors, while the silence of the ship settled uneasily around them. Minutes later, they pushed through the chamber door into the main corridor. The lights were flickering, casting long, jagged shadows along the narrow walls. Elena activated her wrist terminal, but the ship's diagnostics gave nothing but static. Something wasn't right. The air smelled faintly wrong, like rusting metal mixed with an undertone of something organic and sickly sweet. "Ship's systems are glitching," Reyes said, inspecting a flickering console as they moved deeper into the corridor. "Oxygen scrubbers are barely holding. Life support is on, but it's unstable." "What caused it?" Alex asked. Reyes shook his head. "Unknown. But look at this." He pointed at the corridor walls. "There's growth." Elena stepped closer. Black, sinewy tendrils had begun spreading along the seams of the bulkhead. At first, she thought it was wiring that had come loose, but the texture was wrong. Fleshy, pulsing faintly. She swallowed hard. "Engineering first," Elena said firmly. "We need to—" A scream tore through the air. Hewitt. They spun toward him. Hewitt had moved a few steps ahead and was now staring at the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief. Something black and slick was moving across the deck beneath his boots. It slithered like an oil slick, tendrils unfurling and curling back as though sniffing the air. "What the hell is that?" Hewitt hissed, stepping back. "Don't touch it," Reyes barked. Too late. One tendril shot upward. Hewitt shouted as it wrapped around his ankle, tightening with inhuman strength. Elena lunged forward to help, but before she could reach him, the tendril plunged into Hewitt's leg, piercing through the fabric of his suit with a wet squelch. Hewitt screamed. He collapsed to the floor, writhing, clawing at his leg as black liquid seeped through the wound and spread beneath his skin. The veins on his neck bulged, turning dark. "Get it off!" he shrieked. "Get it the F off!" Alex grabbed a wrench and hacked at the tendril, severing it with a splatter of black fluid that smelled like burning meat. Hewitt fell still, gasping raggedly as Alex and Reyes pulled him back. "It's inside me," Hewitt whispered through clenched teeth. His face was pale, sweat streaming down his brow. "We need to get him to medbay," Reyes said, panic edging his voice. "Move!" Elena barked. She helped them haul Hewitt to his feet, his body limp but shuddering uncontrollably. The black veins along his leg were spreading, branching outward like ink spilled into water. Hewitt's breaths came in shallow gasps as they stumbled down the corridor. "Stay with us, Shark," Alex muttered under his breath. They reached the medbay doors, but before Elena could access the panel, the ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered out entirely, plunging them into darkness. The only sound was Hewitt's ragged breathing and the faint, sickening slither echoing from somewhere deeper within the ship. And then from the darkness came a voice, not human, not mechanical. A low, resonant clicking sound that made Elena's blood freeze. She turned to face the others, barely able to make out their silhouettes in the dark. "We're not alone here." From behind them, something moved, fast. Hewitt didn't scream anymore. That was the first thing Elena noticed when they finally secured him in the medbay. He lay on the examination table, breathing shallow and uneven, his skin pallid and slick with sweat. The black veins beneath his flesh had spread, crawling like spidery roots from his leg to his chest and neck. His face was unnervingly still, as if whatever was happening to him had pressed the pause button on his humanity. Reyes hovered over Hewitt with trembling hands, a scalpel gripped tightly between his fingers. "We have to see what's happening. If it's spreading through his blood, we might still be able to stop it." "Do it," Elena ordered, though her gut twisted as she said it. She stood at the edge of the medbay, her pulse pounding in her ears as Alex gathered tools, and Rhea stood guard by the door, her eyes darting toward every shadow that flickered. The ship's lights had returned but remained dim, casting the medbay in shades of gray. Reyes made a careful incision into Hewitt's thigh. As the blade cut through the skin, a slick black liquid oozed from the wound. It wasn't blood. It was thicker, like tar, and it moved. The entire table jolted as Hewitt's body spasmed violently. "Hold him," Reyes shouted. Alex lunged forward, pinning Hewitt's shoulders while Elena grabbed his legs. Hewitt's eyes snapped open. For the first time in hours, he spoke, his voice a strained guttural rasp. "It's inside me." The words sent ice through Elena's veins. "Hewitt? Mark?" Alex's voice broke. "Can you hear me?" Hewitt's face contorted, as though he was fighting an invisible pressure from within. His mouth opened to scream, but instead a low clicking sound came from his throat. Inhuman, like an insect scraping against glass. Black fluid began bubbling from his mouth, seeping through his teeth and pooling at the corners of his lips. Reyes recoiled, dropping the scalpel. "Oh my God!" Suddenly, Hewitt's chest convulsed, his ribcage bulging outward unnaturally. Something beneath the skin was moving. Elena froze, her hands still gripping his legs as she watched grotesque bulges slide beneath his flesh, stretching his skin to the point of tearing. "It's trying to get out," Reyes whispered, stepping back. Before anyone could react, Hewitt's body arched upward, and with a sickening wet crack, the skin over his sternum split open. Black tendrils shot outward, snapping like whips as they splattered the walls and floor with sticky, foul-smelling fluid. The force knocked Elena backward, sending her crashing into a cabinet. Hewitt's head lolled to the side, his eyes rolling back as the thing emerged, a writhing, sinewy mass of black tendrils. It glistened with moisture, its surface pulsing faintly, as though it breathed. Hewitt's body was little more than a husk, held aloft by the alien growth that now wore him like a suit of flesh. Rhea screamed, drawing her sidearm and firing blindly. The bullets tore through Hewitt's body but did nothing to the thing itself. The creature screeched, the sound vibrating through the medbay walls, and then it moved, the tendrils lashing out. One of them shot toward Reyes. He dove to the floor just in time, but another tendril wrapped around Alex's arm, dragging him forward. He cried out, thrashing as it coiled around his chest, constricting. "Get it off him!" Elena shouted, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed a nearby fire axe from the medbay wall and swung it with all her strength. The blade severed the tendril with a splatter of black fluid, and the creature hissed in response, pulling back. Alex collapsed to the floor, gasping, his face slick with sweat. "Move!" Elena barked, hauling Alex to his feet as Rhea fired another shot. The alien creature reared back, its tendrils twitching and shivering as it drew itself toward the ceiling, melding into the shadows. Hewitt's body dropped limply to the table, nothing more than a hollow, empty shell. The crew stumbled out of the medbay, Elena slamming her palm against the door panel to seal it behind them. The clicking sound echoed faintly from within. In the corridor, the silence was deafening. Reyes was shaking, his hands smeared with blood and black fluid. It used him, like a cocoon. Elena swallowed, her throat dry. "We're dealing with a parasite, something alive." "Alive?" Rhea whispered. She was pale, her hand still gripping the sidearm tightly. "It's spreading, isn't it?" Reyes nodded grimly. "It infected him through the wound. It's in the atmosphere, too. Whatever that thing is, it's spreading through spores." Elena's heart sank. "Then we're all exposed." "No," Reyes said quickly, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "It might need a host to gestate. We're not showing symptoms yet, which means it hasn't taken hold." "And if it has?" Alex asked, his voice strained. "How will we know?" No one answered. Elena pushed the thoughts aside, her focus narrowing to survival. "We need to get control of this ship and isolate that thing. Reyes, Alex, start testing the air filters and oxygen scrubbers. If we can't clean the atmosphere, we'll suffocate it out." "And if it's too late?" Rhea asked quietly. "Then we'll burn the whole ship to hell," Elena said, gripping the fire axe tightly. They moved down the corridor, their shadows stretching across the walls. The faint clicking sound followed them, quiet but persistent, like a whisper just out of reach. As they passed a ventilation shaft, Elena's gaze flickered upward. Something watched them from the darkness within the vents. Two faint, glistening points of black where eyes might have been. Elena froze, her breath catching. The thing shifted, disappearing deeper into the vents with a faint scrape of metal. "It's moving through the ship," Elena murmured, and then, far behind them, they heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of footsteps. They turned to look. The corridor was empty. "Come on," Elena said, her voice low and tight. "We need to move." But as they walked, the clicking grew louder, and the footsteps followed. The ship was dying. Elena could feel it beneath her feet, metal groaning, systems failing, and air growing thick with the sickly sweet stench of the parasite. The hum of the Orion 7 that had once been comforting now pulsed irregularly, like a heart on the verge of collapse. They moved silently through the corridors, Elena, Rhea, Reyes, and Alex, each step deliberate, their bodies tense with exhaustion and fear. Hewitt's death hung heavy in the air, and the horror they had witnessed haunted their every move. None of them spoke about what had happened in the medbay. The sounds of tendrils tearing through flesh were etched into their minds. Elena led them toward engineering, gripping the fire axe she refused to relinquish. "We need to disable the engines and shut down the reactor. If we can isolate the ship's systems, we might..." "Might what?" Alex interrupted, his voice a brittle whisper. "Stop it. It's everywhere, Captain. It's inside the vents. It's in us." "Stop talking like that," Reyes snapped, though his eyes darted nervously to the ventilation grates above them. "We're not infected. Not yet." "How do you know?" Alex shot back. "How do you know it's not already using us like it used Hewitt? How do you know it isn't just waiting for the right moment?" Elena stopped walking and turned to face them. "That's enough," she said, her voice low but firm. "We're not dead yet, and I'll be damned if we let this thing take the ship without a fight." Rhea stared down the hallway, her hand clutching her sidearm. "We need to move. It's following us." Elena didn't ask how she knew. The clicking sound, soft but deliberate, had become an ever-present shadow, growing louder in the distance. It echoed through the ship's vents, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. They reached engineering and pried open the heavy steel doors. Inside, the room was suffocatingly hot, steam hissing from pipes that had ruptured under the strain of failing systems. The main reactor core flickered with erratic light, casting twisted shadows across the walls. Reyes rushed to a terminal, wiping sweat from his brow as he accessed the ship's systems. His fingers trembled as he worked. "The ship's controls have been rerouted. It's steering itself. Rerouted? Elena demanded. Reyes nodded grimly. To a destination I don't recognize, somewhere uncharted. The ship isn't broken, Captain. It's been commandeered. Elena's stomach twisted. By what? Reyes didn't look up. By them. A sudden hiss drew everyone's attention. Rhea spun toward the sound, weapon raised. The ventilation shaft above the reactor groaned as something heavy moved inside it. Alex backed away, his hands shaking. It's here. The vent above them burst open with a screech, and a thick black mass of tendrils slithered down, moving with impossible speed. Reyes screamed as the tendrils lashed out, wrapping around his arms and pulling him toward the reactor. "Reyes!" Elena shouted, rushing forward. The biologist thrashed against the tendrils, his face twisted in terror. "Help me! Don't let it!" Before he could finish, the tendrils coiled around his neck, snapping his head back with a sickening crack. Black fluid erupted from his mouth, his body convulsing violently as the parasite forced itself inside him. Reyes dropped to the floor, still as death. For a moment, there was silence. Then he moved. Reyes's body jerked upright, his head lolling to one side as though his spine were broken. The black veins spread across his skin, his eyes glazed and dark. He looked at them, through them, and a low, clicking sound escaped his throat. "It's using him," Rhea whispered, horrified. Reyes's body took a step forward, the movements unnatural and jerky, as if piloted by invisible strings. Black tendrils pushed out from his skin, writhing and pulsing as though alive. The thing wearing Reyes's body spoke then, its voice layered and alien. "You are vessels. You will carry us." Elena felt her blood turn to ice. "What do you mean?" The thing tilted Reyes's head at an unnatural angle, the sound of bones grinding together filling the silence. "Your bodies are malleable. You are hosts. Flesh will adapt. The cycle will continue." "Like hell it will," Elena snarled. She swung the fire axe with all her strength, burying the blade into Reyes's torso. The creature screeched, the sound splitting through the air as black fluid gushed from the wound. Reyes's body convulsed violently before collapsing to the floor. Elena wrenched the axe free, her breaths ragged. The creature's blood hissed as it touched the metal, eating through the surface like acid. "We have to stop it," Rhea said, her voice shaking. "We have to stop all of them." Elena turned to the reactor, her mind racing. "If we can overload the core, we can destroy the ship, burn it and everything on it." "Destroy the ship," Alex whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We'll die." "Better us than whatever this thing is," Elena said firmly. She turned to Rhea. "Help me set the overload protocol. Alex, watch the door." As they worked, the sound of clicking grew louder, multiplying. It was no longer coming from just one place. It was all around them, above, below, inside the walls. "They're coming," Alex said, backing away from the door. "They're here." Elena input the final command, and the reactor core began to glow, its hum rising to a sharp whine. "It's done. We have 15 minutes before the core goes critical." The door to engineering exploded inward. A flood of tendrils poured through, followed by something massive, a writhing, pulsating form that scraped against the walls as it moved. It was a hive, a seething amalgamation of black tendrils and grotesque, half-formed limbs. Faces, human faces, appeared briefly within its mass, screaming silently before they were consumed. Alex screamed, firing his sidearm uselessly into the swarm. The tendrils grabbed him, wrapping around his chest and dragging him into the creature. His screams turned to muffled gurgles as the parasite pulled him inside, his body vanishing beneath its surface. "Go!" Elena shouted, grabbing Ria's arm. They ran. The corridor outside was already infested, tendrils slithering along the walls and ceiling. The lights flickered violently as the ship's systems began to fail. "Captain," Ria said, her voice strained, "it's too late. We're not going to make it." Elena didn't answer. She could feel it too. The faint tremor beneath her skin, the subtle pressure in her head. The parasite was already inside them, waiting. But she kept running. Behind them, the ship screamed as the reactor began to overload. The parasite screeched in response, a sound that reverberated through the Orion 7 like a death knell. Elena glanced at Ria as they neared the escape pods. Her navigator's face was pale, her eyes unfocused. And then Elena saw it, a dark trickle of blood at the corner of Ria's mouth. Ria looked at her and smiled faintly. "I'm sorry, Captain." Before Elena could react, Ria collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing violently. Black veins spread across her skin, tendrils pushing up beneath the surface. Elena turned away and sprinted towards the last escape pod. Behind her, the ship began to shake, and the air filled with the deafening roar of the reactor melting down. The last thing she heard as she launched the escape pod into space was the sound of the parasite's voice inside her head. "You cannot escape the cycle." The escape pod tumbled through darkness. Elena Voss clutched the edge of the console, her knuckles white as the pod shuddered violently. Behind her, the Orion 7 was dying, a fiery bloom of light and debris expanding into the vacuum of space. Through the pod's viewport, she watched the ship tear itself apart, the explosion blooming like a second sun. For a moment, Elena allowed herself to hope. The reactor overload had worked. The ship and the parasite were gone. But then the planet appeared, and all hope drained from her. It loomed massive in the viewport, an alien world bathed in shadow, its surface choked with sickly green clouds and towering spires of twisted, bioorganic growth. Lightning crackled across the atmosphere, illuminating landscapes that seemed alive, as though the very ground was breathing. Pools of thick black liquid dotted its surface, pulsing faintly, like the beat of a distant, monstrous heart. Elena's chest tightened as she felt it, the presence pressing against her mind. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder with every second, 1,000 voices speaking in perfect unison. "You have brought us home." Elena's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she slammed the pod's controls. "Number... No, no, no!" The pod jolted violently as it hit the planet's atmosphere, flames licking at its edges as it hurtled downward. G-forces crushed her into the seat, blurring her vision and ripping the air from her lungs. Through the viewport, the landscape rushed up to meet her. Jagged towers, black oceans, and endless stretches of twisted terrain that seemed to ripple as though alive. The pod struck hard. The impact slammed Elena's head against the console, and for a moment, everything went black. When Elena came to, she was lying on the pod's floor, blood trickling down her forehead. The air was heavy, thick with a humid, metallic smell that burned her throat. Around her, the walls of the pod hissed and groaned, small fractures spider-webbing across its reinforced glass. She forced herself upright, pain radiating through every nerve in her body. Outside the cracked viewport, the alien planet stretched into a haze of sickly light, an unending vista of pulsing life. The ground was covered in black, slick, flesh-like growths that heaved faintly, as though the planet itself was breathing. Elena pushed open the pod's hatch and stepped outside, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, yielding ground. The air was still, yet filled with a faint thrumming sound that vibrated through her bones, a heartbeat that was not her own. She scanned the horizon. There were no mountains, no oceans, only spires, massive bioorganic towers that clawed at the sky, covered in veins of black tendrils that twisted and slithered as though alive. In the distance, one of them cracked open like an enormous cocoon, spilling a thick river of black liquid that crawled across the ground like a living tide. "You have brought us home." The voice echoed through her mind again, louder this time, no longer a whisper but a chorus. Elena pressed her palms against her head, gritting her teeth as the sound swelled to a roar. "No," she screamed. "You're dead. The ship. You're gone." The voices laughed, and then she felt it. A faint shiver beneath her skin. Her breath froze, her fingers trembling as she touched her chest. Something moved inside her, sliding, shifting as though it had been waiting for her to stop running. Her heart pounded wildly as she pulled open her flight suit and stared at her bare skin. The veins along her chest and arms were turning black. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. She staggered forward, her legs weak beneath her. "No, I stopped you, A wave of nausea hit her, forcing her to her knees. The ground pulsed beneath her, rising and falling like the skin of some massive creature. She pressed her hands into it, feeling the faint tremor that spread through her, a rhythm she could not escape. "You are one of us now." The voices were deafening. Elena screamed, clawing at her chest, her nails tearing at her skin until blood trickled down her fingers. It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to stop what was inside her. Her body convulsed violently, her limbs twisting unnaturally as the parasite woke up. Beneath her skin, something shifted, bulges sliding and writhing, stretching her flesh until it seemed ready to tear. Her fingers curled into claws, her jaw locking as a low, unnatural clicking sound escaped her throat. "No," Elena rasped, fighting it with everything she had. "I won't let you." She looked up and froze. In front of her, the ground had opened, splitting like a wound. Rising from it was a figure, something grotesquely familiar, wrapped in black tendrils that dripped with viscous fluid. It was Rhea. Her body was no longer human, her limbs elongated and split into grotesque, insect-like appendages. Her face was stretched into a twisted, serene smile, her black eyes devoid of humanity. "Welcome home, Captain," Rhea said, her voice layered and alien. The tendrils slithered around her like living armor. "The cycle is complete." Elena tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her vision blurred as the parasite's influence took hold, spreading through her mind like wildfire. Memories flashed before her. Hewitt's scream, Reyes's lifeless body, the ship's explosion. And then all of it faded. She fell forward, her palms sinking into the living ground as black tendrils pushed out of her skin, burrowing into the earth. She screamed one last time as her body convulsed, her veins bursting open to release the parasite that had been waiting. The ground beneath her pulsed in response, welcoming her, consuming her. When it was over, Elena stood. Her body was no longer her own. The black veins had overtaken her, her skin slick and glistening. Her eyes were dark, bottomless voids. She tilted her head upward, staring at the sky as the alien world thrummed around her, alive and waiting. Far above, another ship appeared in the heavens, a distant glimmer of light descending toward the surface. Elena, what remained of her, smiled faintly. The cycle continues, and the world pulsed in agreement.